Hello and welcome to the Drax Files Radio Hour with Joe Yardley. My name is Draxter Dupre. I'm still a little bit under the weather. And Joe is also not with us because apparently she's now in Sansar. And so she doesn't want to hang out, waste her time on this podcast anymore. But be that as it may, we press forward. I just came back from Istanbul, Turkey, which is an amazing hotbed of educational use of Second Life, but more on that next month when the video comes out. Today, though, we are tangentially talking about the same thing, a long interview with three fascinating folks who use Second Life in education, but also wrote a book. My guests this week, Andrew Stricker from the Air University, Cynthia Colon, Colorado Technical University, and Barbara Truman, University of Central Florida. They wrote a book entitled Integrating an Awareness of Selfhood and Society into Virtual Learning. Let me read from the description here real quick. Recent technological advances have opened new platforms for learning and teaching. By utilizing virtual spaces, more educational opportunities are created for students who cannot attend a physical classroom environment. Now, for Second Life folks, this is kind of a no-brainer. But this book goes in depth in about intentional communities, avatar representation, and how that frees up imagination and therefore actually skills for leadership. I mean, the Air University is part of the U.S. Air Force. It actually bills itself as the intellectual and leadership center of the U.S. Air Force. So there's that angle to it. But be that as it may, you will see in this long interview, this conversation undoubtedly will give you arguments and points that you can use when you have that debate, which sometimes can be tedious, where you try to convince someone that avatar-based interaction in virtual worlds is empowering. Now, we have much more information on the blog. Let's head right into the conversation. Again, Andrew Stricker, Cynthia Colon, and Barbara Truman, they are now only in OpenSim at the Air University's AU Metaverse. We'll link to it. You can apply for entry. So all the stuff that they're talking about, including topics like character strength development of leaders in cyberspace, digital citizenship and participatory culture. Valerie Hill, who couldn't join us for this show, wrote that chapter. So there's a bunch of guest chapters. Also one on losing weight and being healthy while you're sitting and playing Second Life. Yes, it's true. But here we go. Let's start with Cynthia, who, by the way, goes with the avatar name Lir Lobo in Second Life. Here she is elaborating on why virtual worlds are so good for learning. And, well, Cynthia, a.k.a. Lir, has more experience than most of us in that field.
I've taught 50 university classes in using Second Life, and not all of them were about virtual world content, all types of subjects and all types of levels, from a volunteer with 8th graders, 400 of them for a couple years, to, of course, university students at undergraduate, graduate, and then doctoral level. So my passion and my thoughts on this is there's something interesting that happens when we're represented not just by an avatar, but by the free space, the ability to think and to liberate yourself from the confines you normally have either in physical or online classrooms. This notion of self-expression and the ability to apply what we call design thinking, the ability to create projects, that power of creation, that certain magic that occurs. And it doesn't matter if you're a designer, or if you're an expert in any of this. In fact, all of our students were novices when they began. But very quickly, there's a sense of ownership and there's a sense of exploration and wonder that forms deep connections in the mind and helps you to their studies say that you remember 75% if you do practice by doing activities. But in this case, it's something to do with your connection to the world and others that forms really lasting relationships between you, the others, and the content itself. Barbara, I'll turn it over to you.
I think that was really well said, Cynthia. And gee, how am I supposed to follow that? No, I'm kidding. No, I love what you're stressing, but and I also have a slightly different view compared to the notion of feeling judged, and maybe that there's a lack of that feeling judged. When I think about the role of the avatar and how it serves as a mirror, that has been probably the most transformative aspect of just re-examining the possibilities as we look at our current identity, our past identities, and then the future identities. And when we start having new negotiations with ourselves to heal, to reconnect, to discover, to commune, then I think we get more attached to the environment that supports that kind of transformative endeavor. And then the milieu itself, and this bleeds over into the creation of new forms of communities into our existing physical spaces and relationships.
The critique that I always hear sort of as the role of, I don't know, the token SL evangelist, I get a lot of media inquiries and they always say, yeah, but we lose the grip on the physical world. Can you give me proof, Barbara, that we're not losing the grip? Is it not sucking us away inward into these worlds?
Well, I think, as I have discovered with my two collaborators on the call, it has served to make me more of an activist. So I find myself becoming much more empowered to go out in the physical world and say, please join me, join my colleagues, and let's recreate a better future. And we can play with these models, and we can design the interactions, and we can reflect on what hasn't worked as well as we would like. And so I'm seeing this infection of activism that when you get around these passionate people, and we have all met online, we've met face to face, we've presented face to face, and Cynthia is absolutely right. The depth of the relationships are something that are lifelong and life-wide, and they are priceless to me, and that's what helps me become an evangelist.
So this is primarily then also a function, of course, who you associate with. So you follow your passion, and you will find the people, and then in Second Life or virtual worlds in general, you communicate with them in the sense of space with the avatar. I want to ask Andrew, because it's so interesting. So, Andrew, I often use my dad, who I have a very good relationship with in these podcasts. My dad, when I showed him Second Life for the first time, goes like, wow, that's interesting. But what is this person here? I don't need this person. I said, well, that's your avatar. That's the person that you navigate these worlds with. And my dad said, yeah, I don't need it. It's a distraction. I want to go in there. It's fascinating. I can see the solar system here. So my dad is an engineer, so he's interested in that. For him, the avatar becomes an unnecessary sort of doll or puppet that he doesn't need. Could you make the argument, Andrew, to my dad that the avatar is necessary?
What I find in discussions with people across generational lines is that the sense of who we are for some generational ages is really defined by physical properties and the kinds of young people that we see coming into the Air Force. Their sense of identity is tied to not only the properties of their physical parts of their life, but also their digital lives. And so like your dad, your father, for him to have a sense of an identity that's part of him represented through the characteristics of an avatar could be a bridge too far, for him to associate with in a meaningful way. The interesting thing about the generations we're seeing coming into the Air Force is there is a part of their lives now that is transcending physical properties and melding with digital properties. That's kind of creating a fusion of an identity of who they see themselves as. So in their world, their friendships that are virtual are just as meaningful to them as people they've grown up with in localities. And so we're Cynthia, and Barbara, and I were just absolutely fascinated with these new forms of identities that people have, that have grown up, as it were, with this kind of augmentation of how the mind is aware of what's going on around them. And we think in very bold ways when it comes to the future about new forms of community and new forms of society. One of the things that sort of relates to the three of us from southern Indiana is a German utopian community called the Harmony Society. They came out of Germany around 1805, and they settled in southern Indiana. They built multiple towns, but in Pennsylvania and Indiana. But the one in Indiana is really interesting part of the story, and you'll see that described in our book, where they had this notion that they can actually reinvent the ways that people form together, assist one another. And it had a tremendous impact on Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson met with the society, even hosted their leaders at Monticello. And he got to know them. He helped locate their location along the southern border of the Ohio River and the Wabash area, helped them get settled in. Because in his vision of America, he saw the Harmony Society as ideal for small agrarian-based communities where people could have a sense of strong identities tied to close familiar or family relationships. What we would call like the Gemeinschaft, identity of who you are. And then there is this other competing vision that was represented by Alexander Hamilton that said, well, he really wants large metropolitan areas to be the future of America, strong business, industrial-based capacities where people form into, they have their whole lives associated with these larger groupings and formal society structure, the Gesellschaft. And so all through American history, we've had this sort of dialectics, and the tension is still there.
So Gemeinschaft versus Gesellschaft. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yes, and it's still there. Now, we talk about it in our book as a developmental model where people, as they grow from their comfort, from close, small community associations, and they venture out in the world, so to speak, and form new relationships, and often in civic ways that have, very specific rules of behavior, contractual, understandings about, permissibilities of what you can or cannot do. People feel alienated. And I think your father, for example, if you were to look at an avatar and the abstractness of that, he would have that sense of, this feels a little bit alienated from my personal experiences in life that, has very little to do with digital representations. And the generation that's coming up now, and that many of the students that all three of us work with, they're much more willing to say, okay, I've had my close family relationships, and I'm now forming out extension-wise through my digital, relationships and interactions into this broader sense of who I am. And what's really kind of interesting and bold, transformatively, is that we can go beyond national and geographical boundaries. We can span new forms of communities and societies that, is no longer based on geography.
Like global tribes that are tied together by a shared common interest, making their own worlds. I was just going to add what I realize about my dad is also that he feels he has a problem with mixing playfulness in a serious context. And it's something, whenever I talk to educators in the Second Life context, I also ask them, do they have any pushback from, let's just, I don't know, calling them old school is somewhat unfair, but people who feel like there is just no place for something that looks like a game in sort of a serious educational context.
Yeah, one of the things that I think, and Cynthia and Barbara can chime in on this too, because I know they've got some really great insights on this, but we feel like that over time, as you go from your spontaneity, discovery mode of learning as a child, and you mature and go into what we call formal learning environments and structures associated with rules and contractual relationships as you go into formal studies, that sense of play, that sense of discovery and excitement can just be so constricted in you that as you mature, you begin to think that the only forms of learning, surely must be what you have come out of through your collegiate experiences is something somewhat painful, unpleasant.
I think the Germans still believe that learning has to kind of hurt. If it doesn't hurt, it's like doing push-ups. If it doesn't hurt, it's not worth your while.
And what we find, and again, Cynthia and Barbara can really go into this in greater depth. But what we find is that there's a little bit of a paradox when you free up this rediscovery, as it were, of this playfulness, what Csikszentmihalyi might call flow. He talks about, he has a theory that when you're so involved with something that you enjoy, you don't even realize the passage of time. And I think whether it's in Second Life or other virtual immersive experiences, that certainly people share that they have this phenomenon where they're so caught up in what they're doing that there's almost like a suspension of time. Now, what we know in how the mind works and with new experiences that are very impactful and meaningful, that when you can engage those levels of interactivity to the point where people don't really become or stay aware of time passages, that can lead to a profound experience that has very good qualities. Now, one of the things that Cynthia does in one of the chapters in the book, she talks about a model where that immersion, right? Think of it like a scuba diver kind of experience. So there's a certain depth of excitement when you scuba dive where you'll see things you've never seen before. But if you're not careful, you can go too deep and you won't be able to get back to the surface.
Cynthia, this is great. And actually, let's go to Cynthia now, because then I have a follow-up with the Gesellschaft versus Gemeinschaft. It's very interesting. Cynthia, tell me why being in the flow is a good thing, because somebody told me recently he was in the flow and watched the Kardashians for 12 hours straight, and he called that flow too. So is there a qualitative difference?
Well, that sounded like he was describing his experience as opposed to, see, for me, flow begins with your challenge level being slightly higher than your abilities. So you're intrigued. In other words, you're not passive. And by the way, I've never seen the Kardashians, so my apologies, right? But something about their lives fascinated him so much that he formed a connection with them. And then he describes that as flow. And by the way, in the flow model, for those who are visualizing this as you listen, the flow model has quite a few quadrants. But think of it as you begin at that XY point, what does it take? First off, what's your current level? What do you know, and what are you bringing to the experience? And then as the challenge increases a little bit, that intrigues you, and you invest some energy into it or some connection. You're not just passive. Let's say you're playing a game or you're taking a class that involves games, and so you start to struggle. And you start to make accomplishments, which increase that feeling of flow. Now, if the challenge level goes too high, you start to get worried or you have anxiety because you're no longer performing, you're no longer contributing. So there's some degree of reciprocity to this model, right? This notion of, and if things come too easy in contrast, then you start to get a little bored, right? You're not engaged. For the long haul, you won't continue that activity. So something about watching the Kardashians in the example you presented intrigued him, made him want to know more. And of course, as he kept gathering more information, he became more and more vested in it. For learning in virtual worlds, let's face it, when people first step into the virtual world, everything is foreign. I'm always hearing about the steep learning curve of the viewer, or how complex it is to look around, to use your camera controls, to navigate, to move, to understand this notion of modes conceptually. The fact that, if you're moving through the inventory or the chat, your feet aren't moving, right? Your avatar's not moving. So conceptualizing all of these mechanics, in my opinion, might be one of the elements that actually distracted your dad, made him less engaged with the avatar notion, is because it kind of pins his feet. It anchors him to the world. Whereas when he's not thinking about the avatar, he's almost in mouse-like. He's everywhere. Wherever he looks, that's his world, see? And so the avatar representation, because he's not thinking the social aspect, it's the social aspect that interests us, by the way.
Actually, I think that if you, and I had this experience many times, that when you help a skeptic to get into a virtual world, let's just say Second Life because there really is no other whenever I help people sort of onboard in Second Life, there was acute awareness of or identification with the avatar as soon as someone else approached them and engaged them in a conversation. And I've seen people who were very dismissive and just did me a favor, like, you gotta see this, and they say, okay, I'll check it out. Oh my God. And then all of a sudden somebody walks in, oh, they're talking to me. How does my hair look? It's as simple as that, I guess. Right?
Right. Yeah, because you're forming a personal connection with the experience, and it's very real to you. Often people tease us, say, well, why shouldn't everyone be exactly like their real life selves? And I'm like, why limit yourself? See, I thought it was beautifully put when you mentioned earlier that while we, in the physical world, we're represented the way we were shaped and formed, but in the virtual world, we can be many different things, and it's kind of like all different ways of expressing yourself in such a dramatic palette. And so that brings out all kinds of opportunities for connections. But back to flow, because I know you asked me about that. One of our goals is to give people enough of a challenge, whether it's through activities, through what they're experiencing, through the senses, through the mind space. That's something that's very important to me, and then having them create. When I say create, I don't just mean making things. I mean contributing to knowledge or shaping new ideas and extending beyond themselves, beyond the limits that they impose upon themselves or society does. And so I think those opportunities transform us, right? And that transformation, just keeps building more and more energy. So in the sense, this notion of flow follows Celia Pierce's book, the MIT Press book, on the notion of communities of practice and play. This very playful, where it keeps you keep investing more time and energy because you keep getting more benefit from it, and the more you share that with others, the more it explodes.
Let's get Barbara back in in the interest of balance. What Andrew earlier mentioned is the Harmony Society. I was looking this up, coming from Germany and then settling in the U.S. Gesellschaft versus Gemeinschaft. So Gesellschaft is society. The literal translation, Gemeinschaft, is community. What is Second Life? Is Second Life both? Is one better than the other? I mean, I agree with how you represented this earlier, Andrew, but at the same time, is maybe Second Life the model, the best of both worlds?
Before Barbara answers that, I just want to give you a little preamble. Barbara did some amazing research in understanding how people are invested in Second Life groups or in World of Warcraft communities, guilds, or whatever. And she did some very deep probing research. I was her faculty advisor for her doctoral committee. So she has a wealth of information about this. Go ahead, Barbara.
Well, when I started my research, I was interested in how professional groups collaborate because I had hoped that the technology empowerment would translate between and across the physical and the virtual spaces. I didn't realize how I would have to look at the personal identity as much, because you have to have self-mastery to be able to optimally contribute in a group, in a team, to collaborate. So, we looked at, well, how does this attachment occur? And then why is it different in some people and others? And then how long does it take to have exposure to these environments to get this attachment to both the avatar, the self, and the environment, the milieu? So Cynthia was talking about this making, and I thought of it as generativity, that the environment was so conducive to being able to generate thoughts, emotions, memories, not just having to have the talent of being an artist to express these beautiful, vistas, or a programmer to be able to develop these wonderful scripts, but it tapped into a hidden leadership that I believe that Andy is really studying with the Air Force for character strengths. So
this is amazing. So, are you saying that generally people would not be valued as much because they may not be able to, let's say, a carpenter, can make a bench or a house, but if I'm not a carpenter, maybe they don't appreciate me as much. But in these self-made communities of intent in the virtual world, the people matter on a different scale.
I think we sort of get back to this quest of identifying our originality. And so this is where we discover our strengths. And then as we get with people and we start to work on creating new environments, we start to use strengths-based teams. So this is where I started to realize that this was a new art of living, and that it was a tech-enabled embodiment of hope, that just people who don't appreciate these environments, aren't aware of these environments, are missing out on these opportunities to cultivate their self.
Why are we not able to do this in the physical world? Why are we not allowed to discover our strengths? Are we sort of forced into these cookie cutter labeling categories, or?
Well, Barbara's thinking about that one. One of the things that comes to mind to me is Jeremy Bailenson work at Stanford when it comes to avatar and identity, as far as the avatar and how it translates to the real world person. This notion of when you have really tall avatars and you do various things, you're very empowered in the virtual world, how does that translate to the real world? What I like to call it is charisma. Regardless of your walk of life, regardless of your position or stature or how people view you in the community, you don't have those boundaries, in my opinion, in the virtual world. And so that freedom, that opportunity to be far more than perhaps you self-identify in the physical world, it just opens all kinds of pathways. And that charisma, I believe, translates back to the physical world. So it doesn't mean that if you have a really tall avatar and you have all these very empowering traits in the virtual world, that you're going to be a powerful person in the real world. But your charisma and what you do with it, you now have this potential. It's like you have more tools in your tool set that you can draw upon, that strength, that inner strength, if you will. What you do with it, what you decide to do, that therein, it still depends on you, the person.
That is actually one of the things I think in the physical world that we don't get enough opportunity to do, is to reflect. There are so many people that are consuming information and they are not generating original thoughts, they are not getting the empowerment and the freedom to explore in the kind of ways that you can do in the virtual world. So I think we have a fundamental misunderstanding of ourselves, of our society, of our communities. And we have to, it takes too much effort to reconcile all the differences that we have to negotiate on a daily, moment-by-moment basis in some cases, especially in times like these that are contentious for social justice, where in the virtual worlds we don't, we see expressions of different races, genders, ages, all the abilities. We see a whole panoply of members that make up the tapestry in the environment, and that's probably my best answer.
I couldn't agree with you more, but of course I'm going to play devil's advocate. Now I'm going to jump at you and say, but wait a minute, this is exactly that people just escape into this world, and it was actually pretty much what I said earlier. But that's what the irony is, that a lot of people who would criticize a virtual world, they would criticize them on the grounds that what you just said, it's doing the exact opposite.
One of the things I think it can be said is that the physical world is actually a form of entrapment to the human potential. And what I mean by that is that because of the structures and the basis in which people have to operate with the limitations of the geography in which they're currently existing in, there is much more stringent boundaries on the art of the possible in terms of how you express your identity, how fluid you have with your choices to move in new directions. Stereotypically, you're cast in certain expectations and norms. And so one of the things that we're interested in, like with our development of our officers in the Air Force, is we want them to have experiences in which they can reimagine who they can be as extraordinary people that will help shape not only the Air Force, but society at large. And what we find in these virtual immersive experiences is that for the first time, many of them feel like they're able to explore and look at new ways of thinking about how they form into teams, what is possible, what I call their action models. And in the research, when we look at people who are in the practice of a certain profession, their physical environment in which they engage in that practice as a professional is actually very constrictive about how they are expected to operate and perform, and even how they think of themselves. So one of the things that to myself, and I'm sure Barbara and Cynthia can additionally highlight this, is that what we might be witnessing is an involvement of the human experience, like a Heidegger notion of where the human experience is evolving to what is potential and it can really truly emerge into. It's like a transcendental notion here that there is something deeply profound about the destiny of the human experience. And so I don't feel as threatened necessarily by the emergence of the virtual part of human experience. I actually think we have gone in this direction because in some ways it is going to be liberating. And is there dangers? Yes, but with every liberating future in which the human race discovers and puts definition to, that's always been true.
Isn't there a danger in the Air Force that you give your Air Force pilots too much learning about reconstructing their identity, and all of a sudden they're starting like, I don't want to be an Air Force pilot. I want to be painting paintings while I listen to Renaissance music naked by the riverside.
Yeah. One of the things that I found, like I spent several years teaching at the Air Force Academy, and I throw this out as for consideration. Many people that I noticed coming in the Air Force Academy had already preconceived notions of what they thought the Air Force was about or what they were going to do with their time in the Air Force, and it usually had something to do for a period of time. You know, they saw their service in the Air Force as a choice to be made for a period of time. And one of the things that we were trying to suggest to the young cadets there was, what about the possibility that the profession of arms is a way of life, and you evolve, you know, and you mature, you grow in that understanding as a way of life. Well, that was very radical to many of the cadets, right, to think that way. and so we're getting back to that again in larger ways with what we can do with virtual experiences, right? We want to reintroduce this notion that your identity is not set in concrete. Your experience with the Air Force is not episodic. You can actually reinvent yourself in your service and how you think of your service with the Air Force as part of a very, very noble way to live out one's life. And so this gets back to this notion of the guardian that is in Plato's Republic, right? Where in the kinds of democracies that we're trying to always keep healthy, we want citizens to have this notion of what it means to commit yourself in lifelong service. You can be in uniform, it can be out of uniform, but if you're in uniform, it can be very transformatively shaped in how you think about, this notion that you have a very special place in how you build stronger, services and what you do to keep society healthy. And so we want to try to bring this back and not think so much of one's time with a military service as vocational, so it's a grand effort. But like Barbara was suggesting earlier, we're getting at it through positive psychology. They put a lot of emphasis in the understanding and study of virtues and character strengths. And we know so much more now than we did a few years ago about.
And I was just going to throw in, because, it's pretty clear also in the chapter, says reconstructing professional identity. So the sort of tongue-in-cheek comment that I made, like, I was, I don't know, I was an airline pilot, but now I want to be a ballerina or something. For you, this is still in the same professional context. It is in a given framework. We're not talking about completely dropping out of society or anything like that. Although this could be an option, I guess. But
yes, one of the things in mature rate, what we call developmental model of human development. As you evolve through your experiences into larger sets of interactions with people from different backgrounds and so forth, that there is a point in your development where it's somewhat of a threshold where you get to a certain level of maturity of thinking where you're getting a good balance between assimilation and accommodation. In other words, we don't want ideally people to settle for only self-selecting into groups of their friendships or other parts of their community lives of things that's to their comfort. We want people to be willing to assimilate new ideals, experiences in cross-cultural ways, that they have a deeper awareness of the interdependencies of themselves with others. And for us in the Air Force, this is instrumentally important. We need officers and airmen that understand in deeper ways the factors associated with their military service, with different types of cultures and issues that go across civil and military structures. And so they need to be identified with the public. They need to be identified with the impacts of their choices and decisions and the ripple effects, what we call second and third order effects of their decisions that go beyond what we call kinetic power to non-kinetic issues, that we're facing so much around the world today.
In my opinion, because I've noticed an impact in my own personal life as far as health and well-being and self-image and how it translates to the physical world, is this notion of if you can see what you think what your ideal, your dream self, then you see your real self. This reminds me of the Ramapo Project, where we took 8th graders and we said the first day, make your ideal self. And they did, the supermodel, the visionary, the Darth Vaders, etc. And then they said, okay, make your real self, your identity. And they did that, and they talked about that. And then they said, let's do the opposite gender. Who's your ideal self? And they became outrageous. The guys made Dolly Parton-like females, and the girls made Arnold Schwarzenegger, but overbulked, so they could hardly move. And then they were all hostile and angry and talking. And then the 4th day we said, okay, let's take some combination of these selves, and you come up with the person you're most comfortable with, the person you'd like to live with, to be. And of course, that wound up being a mix of a real and ideal, and it had some thoughtfulness behind it. And I think once we get a sense of that, then we have this thing to aim for, these goals, and you also get this sense of control. See, in the daily life, we don't always feel like we're in control. I know you could say we can run more laps or push-ups, but usually life interferes with that, and that's not part of our decision criteria. It's not part of our life. Yeah.
This is so well put, and I think it goes back to the power of imagination. I couldn't agree more. With music, it's best to explain, because we visualize ourselves performing the piece perfectly. That's a part of the routine. And if I visualize myself then even more concretely as an avatar who is my ideal self, maybe I can get there. Is that part of it?
Oh, I believe so. Absolutely.
Absolutely. That's very well put. I play several instruments too, and you're right. You get a sense of it in your mind. You get a sense of the music, and it's not just the collection of notes and their assemblage. It's something that transforms you, something that strikes a chord deep within you. And once that connection is formed, then your hands start to do it. Your body participates, and you get into a sense of flow.
And in the Second Life context, we have an avatar who represents our ideal, and we can travel with this avatar through these worlds that are of our making, of the making of people that we connect with, and that gives us the power to imagine that the way this avatar behaves, in the all the virtues that this avatar possesses, we also possess in the physical world.
Yes.
That's right. If you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you're describing self-actualization and how you get into this space where you're very spontaneous, creative, you're realizing your inner meaning and potential. And the challenges, the folks who are concerned with addiction, are when we forget our physiological needs and our safety and security, when we get so entranced with these opportunities that are just breathtaking, that we forget about eating and life skills and work and all the other life balance. And of course, at first, there's a certain naivete and frankness about it that it's hard to distance yourself from that. But I think over time, as this becomes more of the norm for you, where you start to feel your self-esteem rising, your self-actualization, everything else, I think you reach a point, almost not, I don't want to say a plateau, but at least a point where some of us are able to handle it. I've been playing World of Warcraft since 2004. I'm in educator guilds through ISTE and World of Warcraft, and anyone you'd ask would say I'm deeply a compulsive player, but I don't play every day because everything else becomes equally important. And I think you reach a point where you start valuing other aspects of your life, the research, the work, the education, the second life, everything we do has value.
Well, we also really need to stress this again, that that addiction is a serious issue. It's a disorder that can find several different outlets. It could be alcohol, it could be illegal drugs, or it could be a role-playing game, and we need to look at the underlying issues.
Right. I was speaking of addiction in general because anything that becomes so entrancing and exciting, and you're powerful, you're doing well, you love what you're doing, you'll want to do more of it. It's kind of like the person who grabbed Facebook and had to go post real quick that you illustrated earlier. But see, that's where I differentiate, because I think that and Sherry Turkle is doing some really good research on this. This is this instant gratification thing. I mean, to me, Second Life is the antidote to that. Second Life is actually a place where I can, again, what Barbara said earlier is sort of this continuous thought that I have when I'm writing, and I do sort of single tasking, right? Actually, interestingly enough, Second Life provides you with the ability, if you choose to do that, to single task and to really get deep into one thing, while the multiple distractions of other digital offerings are doing the exact opposite and keeping you from focusing, I think.
Yes.
That may be the way you're using Second Life.
It's the way you
I have
use
to
it, yeah.
confess. I'm in 62 groups, and I musical chair between 20 more of them. And I'm at the Shawnee Library listening to stories. I'm going to events. I'll go to 3 events in the same hour, and I'll be hopping, or I'll have different avatars sitting at all of them, trying to reconcile the voices in my head. I'm serious. So someone would possibly say I have an addictive personality, but I don't think of it as a disorder. I think of it as an extreme fascination with everything that's going on, and some desire to scoop up as much of it as possible, to suck the marrow, if you will.
and I think, Cynthia, between both of you, the common ground is there is a sense of meaningfulness in what you're doing, right? So
that is
maintaining
correct.
what you yes.
Well, and it's interesting because the bookend to end the book is on transdisciplinarity, which would need a whole radio show in itself. But it's actually the unification of both. It's both and. It's like the prism that can have the light and form it into a laser, but also separate it out into its beautiful colors. Yeah, it's natural. It's like nature.
Mm-hmm. Because one of the things that I sense from you during this interview that you're picking up from all 3 of us is that it's such a amazing phenomenon that we have before us, that it requires a multidisciplinary kind of way of looking at it from all these perspectives to get at the full scope of not only what is happening, but what could be for the future. And that's one of our motivations for the book, was how do we bring in these really rich perspectives from all these lenses and ways that you can interpret it, because so much of what we see that's being published out there currently, they're very singularly focused, and there's value, but there's something lost when say Second Life is interpreted through 1 or 2 lenses.
You're preaching to the choir. I've been trying for 10 years now. I'm trying to go back and forth between sort of a quote-unquote serious use of the virtual world and then a more leisurely pursuit, or the economic angle. Okay, so in the interest of time, I need you guys to go from abstraction to concrete examples. How do you create environments and tools to accomplish what you're seeking to accomplish?
Yeah, I mean, one of the examples too that we give in the front part of the book is the recreation of New Harmony from 1821 virtually, where you can actually go in and have an experience that you wouldn't otherwise obtain from just reading about the society. And you can see the kinds of problems that society faced and ways that they approached the problems as a community. And then you also see a side of the community as the scientists took hold of it. Robert Owen came over from England and occupied the northern half of the town and brought in scientists that led to a number of scientific discoveries and even the basis for the first formation of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. So there's this wonderful dialectical representation of these things that we've been talking about for the past hour, represented in the actual physical New Harmony town. Well, we recreated that virtually so people could experience it anywhere from any place around the globe. And they have a way to then compare, the kinds of issues from one period of time to contemporary sets of issues. They have a way to, take different perspectives by playing a role. They can play the role of a small utopian community. They can play the role of a scientist. And we're doing the same thing as Cynthia highlighted in the Air Force, where we're blending history with contemporary issues and then showing possibilities for the future. And that helps, like you were saying earlier, with the imagination.
Barbara, you want to pick an example that you're using or have used, or something where Second Life is sort of unique in its affordances?
Yeah, sure. Well, for myself personally, I was listening to one of the campus leaders describe future scenarios, and they were talking about forces that people needed to pay attention to. And I listened to this via PowerPoint slides, and I sat there thinking about, well, what would this look like in a virtual environment? So I didn't have the experience to really design. I'm not an artist, but I was able to at least get to a place where I could start storyboarding on PowerPoint and then get with people and say, how could this work? What would this look like? What kind of interactions might we have, to where there became an environment that could be experienced and shared based on a simpler model. So I too am looking at how others design and develop these environments and trying to choose some of the best approaches. We have a desperate need to get more people who know what's possible through direct experience so that they can guide the subject matter experts who can then illustrate and animate with imagination what's possible. I go back to your question when you were struggling, trying to figure out what else you could be. And I sat here thinking, hydrologist, Drax, you should be a hydrologist. You could illuminate yourself as a drop of water, and you could, penetrate different types of rocks, and you could have different states, and you could be frozen, and you could be gaseous. And so my mind just started going crazy,
What she just mentioned, Andy designed a world called the Mars Geothermal, and we did an IRB. It was a formal experiment, and we said, what would happen if half of the people participating in it weren't human? If they were a drop of water, a water molecule, or if they were a code fragment from the Matrix, would their somatic experience, their relationship to the world change, and would they remember better? And so we're always doing one of these, what if, this art of the possible.
And then wait till we all get together and we become a force of nature.
That's it. Now, I have one other thing. So Barbara, when she was a student, she designed a game for Greek mythology, and her part was Pandora's Garden. And while she's taking us through this tour of her game and her videos and her experience, she opens the box, and out comes all the things that come out. And as that's happening, she transforms into the phoenix before our eyes in mid-sentence while she's still talking. So now she's this bird on fire, having gone from a Greek goddess, and of course, it was just an amazing presentation, and of course, quite breathtaking. And so when I think of the application of all these ideas that we've been expressing, the self-expression, I keep thinking back to that scene. And by the way, all those visuals are online, so if you need any of those. But each of them has designed so many different examples of how to apply what we're talking about today.
And that was such a great story as well, because everyone forgets that even though the evils were all unleashed, hope remains in the vessel. And then it was only through, creating the story in the virtual world to go back to antiquity and look at the story and go, wow, we all got it wrong. It wasn't a box at all. It's a jar. It was lost in translation.
My final question briefly. Now we're moving forward with more immersive technology, with head-mounted displays and such. Going forward through this virtual reality hype, and I don't know if you're even in that realm. Through my line of work, I'm constantly confronted with people who have no clue about the power and achievements of Second Life and the people who made it, but they're talking about headsets and they're talking about virtual reality, and all they talk about is basically tech specs, like, oh, the resolution of the goggles are amazing. So what's your take on it? Is this an exciting time? Is this going the right direction, or is it kind of going backwards a little bit? Take it where you will.
It's natural for the industry to think of marketing opportunities, right? And what we've been describing today is immersion through the experience, through the personal and social, not through the technological, in the sense of having to wear a device and to sense the world visually. It kind of alarms me that even our community in the virtual world is starting to define VR by the headsets and by the...
Yeah, you're putting the finger right on it. Exactly. That's exactly what I'm talking about.
They're losing the value. Yeah, and I kind of resent that, because as a researcher who's been in the field since 1995, that's when I bought my first headset, right? And I did studies on immersion, using human subjects for my doctoral work. And so I've seen the long haul, and Andy uses quite a few in his work. Barbara's probably used a few in hers, but Andy also uses the virtue sphere, the big hamster ball, and all these other things in their work. And the thing is, those things are nice. They're trying to simulate aspects of the physical sensory experience, but that's not what makes immersion this transformational thing. That helps to give it to the masses who don't get it through the social interaction and this investment in communities. Well, and I have to admit, I was cited a year ago as a naysayer about all this technology. But the reason I was, by wearable.com out of the UK. But the reason is not because I don't love this community and all the technology. It's the fact that I want to have a great user experience. And that's what you just latched onto. The notion that whether we're on a low-end system, whether we're on a handheld, whether we have accessibility issues, whatever, that everyone has an opportunity for it to be their world. And secondly, that we don't devalue this by all of a sudden redefining VR as you got to wear a head-mounted display device, you got to have gesture-based recognition. And so now people are thinking of virtual worlds as this very casual kind of thing, this ad hoc, it was transitory or whatnot, whereas I think it's something that's lasting and persistent.
All right, a long conversation here, intense. That was, again, Cynthia Cologne. Oh my God, I hope I pronounce her name correctly, aka Lyra Lobo. And the other speakers were Andrew Stricker from the Air University and Barbara Truman from the University of Central Florida. You can meet them in the Air University's metaverse based on OpenSim. And the title of the book is the title similar to the title of this show. The title of the book is Integrating an Awareness of Selfhood and Society into Virtual Learning. Published by IGI Global, Disseminator of Knowledge, $200 as a hardcover, ebook the same price. I know that we have a lot of listeners who represent universities. Go get your administrator, buy that book and put it in the library. I think it's quite important. Now, this is the end of the show. Let's wrap it up really swiftly, as I am stressed out about the educational video about Istanbul University, which is going to be pretty vast in its scope as well. We're linking to a whole bunch of things. As I said, Sherry Turkle, also contextual. We talked about her, the Harmony Society. What else did I wanted to mention? Oh, yeah. My 10th Res Day is on February the 20th. I don't know what's going to happen. Maybe somebody throw me a surprise party. I don't know. That'd be cool. But the next show will be a special show next Saturday. And it will have to do with what Second Life means to people. I think it's going to be a nice one. But until then, have a fabulous weekend and keep engaged in whatever world you're in. And I hope that Joe Yardley emerges from Sansar. That's it. Have a great weekend. Bye.
The Drax Files Radio Hour with Joe Yardley is a weekly production of Basic Drax Entertainment. The show is supported by Time Portal, SL Artist, Warbug, Bay City You Know for Kids, 01 Heavy Industries Corporation, Extraordinary, Ionic, Maven Homes, Giza Creations, Botanical, Strawberry Sing, Abranimations, Eros Avatars, Caravel Design, The Cube Republic, What Next, Landscapes Unlimited, Fallen Gods Incorporated, and Death Row Designs. Thumbnail by Justin Esparza. Contact the show via Skype, Draxfiles, Avatar Draxfiles, or email radio@draxfiles.com.